Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I guess is a First Blood special. I did tell Sam we should make it called something different, but he's lazy, and apparently, because we don't pay him, we can't force him to actually do any work. So we were thinking about calling it League of Legends or Law of the League or something like that. But it is indeed another First Blood special about Law, League of Legends, and of course our good friends at Riot Games. To come on to this hot topic of discussion is going to be Bryce Blum, who we've already met. You know him as Esports Law. We have had him on the show before, but for those who haven't seen him, I'll tell you that he's an associate in the Foster Pepper firm's litigation and dispute resolution practice, as well as doing esports representative matters. Is that a fair summary, Bryce?
Yeah, I think the litigation is a holdover from when I used to do a lot more litigation, and over time, the esports stuff has really crowded that out. So yeah, I would say I'm, at this point, mostly an esports lawyer.
Awesome. And with us as well for the first time, and certainly I hope not the last, is going to be Anna B. Baumann, who holds a degree in German law and is currently a PhD researcher and lecturer. She describes herself as an avid gamer and has researched on acceptance through arbitration, appeal, and administrative procedures. Player protection in professional League of Legends is a very important issue to her, as it is to me. So welcome on the show, Anna. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you very much.
Now, Anna's calling from her office, so we apologize if the video or the sound cuts out from time to time. We'll do all we can to mitigate that. But what brought us all together to have this discussion today was, of course, the ongoing issue that has occurred between the player Corey, who, well, currently plays for MYM, and indeed that organization themselves. I'm sure you've all heard about it by now, but of course we know that what happened was MYM management effectively threatened to remove the player's mother's house if he breached his contract and left the team. Since then, that manager has been fired by the organization. Riot have issued a fine to MYM of $5,000, and the matter is now mostly, kind of pushed to one side and swept under the carpet. Now, I'll bring you in, Bryce, because we talked about this at the time it happened, and we mentioned a few things to each other about this. I suppose there's a lot of people out there that are thinking, why bring this up again? It's been dealt with. Riot have made a ruling. Riot have made a decision. The player seems to be satisfied with the outcome, and the person who perpetrated the horrible deed is fired. So why on earth do we need to keep talking about it, Bryce?
Well, I think because what this situation brought to light is some of the structural inadequacies with the LCS system in general, specifically with the grievance and dispute resolution procedures. And these inadequacies have existed for a really long time. I've dealt with them personally a few times in my practice. But the nice thing about this situation is so much of the behind-the-scenes detail became public. I'm not going to sit here and say I think we have all of the exact same information as Riot, but so much of it was made public. We were able to kind of get an insider look into how this process went, how this process tracked from the beginning of, the dispute. Corey leaves, he comes over to, Canada, the United States, and you see Riot's decision, he goes back, right? So we can kind of follow all of this as it happens. And the reality is, while I'm glad there was, moral outrage in the community, and I think it's important that we all really care about these players and these individual situations, for me, my focus has always been kind of at the higher level in the structure. And the question is really, was justice done in this case, and is the procedure set up so that justice will be done, more importantly, for all of the cases that will arise throughout the life of the LCS. And I think the answer to that's no, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in more specifics as we go through the show.
Okay, and the same question to you, Anna, because your special area, the thing that you're passionate about, very much like myself, is player protection in esports. It's something that I've been an advocate of for 10 years, doing what I can as a journalist to kind of promote it. Do you think, as Bryce puts it, justice was done in this instance, and why do you think this is an important touchstone case to be bringing up?
I mean, as you know, I wrote about it and I called it a sad day for player protection because actually I was pretty shocked about the fact that a fine for an organization could be mitigated by an alleged breach of that player towards meteor makers. I mean, this is somehow absolutely disconnected. And to me, that sends the message like, okay, so if your player misbehaves, maybe it is okay to harass him a little, you know, because we will reduce your fine when your player breaches or allegedly breaches the contract with you. So I thought that was quite a shocking fact, to be honest, and we need to talk about this, how these rulings are written and what kind of impact they can have on players and player behavior.
Do you think then that the fact that the individual was fired by the organization and Riot have completely forbidden him from being involved in anything pertaining to League of Legends LCS, and also that they issued a fine, which, given the severity of fines, it's still quite a high one, $5,000. I think the highest we've ever seen in League of Legends is I don't think we've gone above $20,000 yet. So yeah, it's still quite sizable. Do you not think that's sufficient? Because obviously, what Riot was saying was that they didn't necessarily want to intervene in what was essentially a dispute between a player and an organization, and also that they acknowledged that the player had indeed done something wrong, that he had essentially breached his agreement.
Look, I think it's important to get it right what happened here and how to assess it legally. And I mean, I know it wasn't very popular when I said you should have separated all those rulings, looking at the individual entities, right? At Rotterdam, the manager, and then Meteor Makers, maybe Superhot Crew also involved with some payment issues, and then Corey. I mean, obviously, what's here at stake for the integrity of the LCS, that it hurts the LCS when a player fails to show up. You know, if he has a contract to show up and he doesn't show up, it's bad for the show and the competition. So Riot could address that. But I think it's wrong to, imply that the fine was mitigated because of his behavior. I mean, the amount itself, I'm totally fine with that. I think it's a reasonable amount. When people compare it to, you've read a lot about it, like, oh, CLG got fined 10,000 and now Meteor Makers less for harassing a player. I don't think that plays a huge role here.
Yeah. So I'll bring you in at this juncture, Bryce. I think one of the things that struck me, and it was something all three of us agreed upon based on the comments that we posted in the subsequent Reddit threads about this, was it was very surprising that Riot had made the decision to even mention Corey's alleged breach of contract in this particular instance, because as again we all know, it's not actually linked to what Riot were punishing or penalizing MYM for. Why do you think it's important that for future rulings, Riot keep any alleged transgressions of the player separate from any alleged transgressions of the organization?
Well, I don't necessarily think that in all future decisions, the actions of the player need to be removed from the situation and considered in a vacuum, and the same thing for a team. I mean, these situations are complex, and, in a world in which, let's say hypothetically, Corey had threatened the family of the manager, right? Then, if the manager had responded to that and threatened Corey, I think then it would be a very different situation, right? It would be analogous behavior. You would need the context of Corey's threat to be able to understand the manager's threat. Like, obviously that's not what happened here, but you could envision in a case in which kind of the relativity of the wrongdoing between the parties would need to be weighed to figure out what is a just resolution. I think what Anna's really highlighting, and I think it's an important point to bring up, is that that's not really what was happening in this case, right? I mean, on the one hand, you were penalizing MYM for structural deficiencies in leadership, for basically the fact that they need to be accountable to what their employees are saying and doing, and whether or not Corey wanted to leave and whether or not he had the right to leave, it seems to me would be divorced from that consideration. Obviously, if Corey was in fact breaching his contract, it would potentially justify MYM trying to stop Corey from leaving and going to Riot and saying, hey, we think he's breaching his contract and we want you to tell him he can't just go do that on, for whatever reason. We want you to stop him from playing with other teams. That would be the rational reaction of an organization that feels like a player is going to do something it's not legally supposed to do. Threatening a 17-year-old kid's family is not. And I don't think that we want to play the game where MYM's punishment can somehow be determined vis-a-vis Corey's alleged wrongdoing in this case. So, it's not that I would never envision a situation in which it would make sense. And it's also unclear the extent to which it did, right? I mean, it's a sentence which they could have chosen not to write in their public post on this. And so it definitely weighed in. We just don't know how much. Were they considering a $10,000 fine, but then they factored this in and it became $5,000? Part of this is the real lack of transparency in the process and in the decision-making itself. All we know is that it's something that was in Riot's minds, but we don't have any sense relativistically of how they weighed all this information out in reaching their decision.
One of the things that struck me as well, Anna, was that there wasn't a lot of talk from Riot about the player protection issue. Because here at the heart, for me at least anyway, the heart of the issue is this is someone that didn't feel comfortable in the environment they were in. They tried to recuse themselves from that environment. They wanted to get into a new environment, be that a new team or just simply out of the gaming house. They were threatened, which would lead me to deduce that if that happens in that instance, these people probably aren't dealing with a 17-year-old in a manner that's befitting someone of 31 years old interacting with younger people. So Riot didn't talk a lot about what they were going to do moving forwards to support players that find themselves in this situation in future. And that for me was a huge oversight on Riot's part, given that this is what caused the issue. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it's a missed opportunity to actually, come out and say, this is our plan towards the future to make sure that people are not put into this situation. Because, we don't know the whole situation, but to me, it seems like it's a young player. He's overwhelmed by the situation. He obviously doesn't know what to do, what he's obliged to do, contractually. But on the other hand, he doesn't feel good. And then in the aftermath, he gets even threatened. So what do we do about it? Riot could have said maybe, they check in closer with players. I don't know, keep closer tabs of how's the environment doing. I don't know if there are some kind of best practice guidelines how to manage an LCS team. I have no idea, but I think maybe it would be a good idea looking at the situation, what happened at MYM. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, of course, you can put the burden on Riot, but you could also say, okay, maybe it's time that players take care of themselves. This has been around for a long, long time. Of course, it's new to every player who's young and comes into the scene, but this has always been part of esports, right? That they're young players and they're put into situations where they just don't know how to help themselves. So they seem to need some kind of, guidance, advice, representation to help them in situations like this. I don't know if he has a lawyer, if someone has advised him to, bring this to the authorities, that he was harassed this way. There are a lot of possibilities what he can do here. So, and to protect himself. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree. There has to come a point where players certainly need to take responsibility to represent their own interests in the best way possible, rather than deferring that to all of these third parties, which is something I think we'll get onto a little bit later in the show. This is a question that I think is definitely worth asking used to people because it's something that I think a lot of people were kind of questioning at the time when the story broke. And that is, when is it acceptable for somebody to attempt to breach a contract, to move away from an agreement on the grounds that they don't think one side, one party in that agreement is upholding their end of the bargain, or when they feel that the current nature of the agreement isn't going to work for them from, for example, a welfare issue. Was Corey, did he at any point have any kind of rights to make a decision to breach the agreement that was in place? And would you guys ever point to instances where you think that it's acceptable to do so?
Sure. So, I think this is one of those times where it's really nice to have both Anna and I on the show, because I can talk about this from a U.S. law perspective, and then she can talk about this from a German EU law perspective. And there will definitely be some nuance, but there will definitely be some nuance depending on where you are and what type of law governs your contract. So be aware of that at the outset. As a kind of framing point for this, and I think this will be true for both of us, whether or not you can terminate a contract because the other side has materially breached their obligations is a highly, highly fact-bound analysis. We can talk about the general principles here, and I've written about it in one of the the many Reddit threads I posted in the aftermath of this. But the reality is, it is always a good idea to consult a lawyer, give them all of the information surrounding your specific circumstances, and then figure out whether or not you may or may not have rights. That being said, we can talk about this in broad strokes. So the principles are whether or not, there are a variety of bases, right? 1L, your first year of law school, you do a year of contract law in the United States. And a big part of it is, what qualifies as a breach of contract, and when is that breach material? Material just means significant in legal speak. It means that the other side has breached in a way that goes to the heart of the bargain. So a really easy example of a material breach, right, is not getting paid. If you're a services contract and you're not being paid, then it's like that breach is likely to be material depending on how long it goes, right? It's not they owed me $1,000 on May 1st and it's May 2nd and I haven't got my money yet, therefore I can terminate, right? It's not that simple. A big part of the relevant legal concepts here are whether or not you're obligated to give the other side an opportunity to cure, whether it's a type of breach that can in fact be cured, right? Because there are certain types of breaches that couldn't. If someone hasn't paid you, well, they could just pay you the next day. If someone has actively wronged you in some way, if there was a non-disparagement clause or something like that in an agreement, and they make a massive, very public post denigrating you and your character, potentially that couldn't be cured, right? We could run a million hypos on this. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, and this is just within the world of contract law, right, is if the other side has materially breached the agreement, or there's also a concept that's called anticipatory breach, which means they affirmatively tell you, I'm not going to pay you, right? I refuse to pay you at all for the future of this contract. That's another principle. With the MYM Corey situation, you've got the nuance of tort law, which is really important to this, right? It's not just did MYM breach the contract by threatening him? If it were in the U.S., there's a bunch of workplace anti-harassment, codes of conduct that employers can and cannot follow, and so there's the entire realm of tort and statutory law to consider, which could color the contract. So I could go on and on. I think there's a lot of really specific law about this. But I think the 2 points I would want to make here is, one, it's fact bound, and make sure you can consult an attorney before making a decision to walk out in an agreement. Make sure that you've followed the proper protocols for giving the other side the opportunity to cure, et cetera. And then the second point I want to make, and I think this is a big one, is what we're going to talk, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go on, is from a structural deficiency standpoint, right? It's not just whether Corey had the right to terminate this agreement. It's, did he have an effective means to actually enforce that right? So if let's assume for the purposes of argument that he 100% was in the right in terminating the agreement and walking away, in a world in which MYM can go to Riot and say, he was not in the right. We have a valid agreement that's still in effect. He could not terminate this agreement, or he did not properly terminate this agreement, or whatever. What would happen? And since Riot's not in the business of resolving, as they'll say, resolving contractual disputes between the parties, the answer is not much, right? I mean, Riot will basically say, hey, you two go work this out, figure it out. And that's, what one thing that's really lacking here that exists in traditional pro sports is an efficient, cheap, and effective, short-term way to resolve these types of disputes, so that if Corey, wants to walk away, he files a grievance, it can get resolved quickly before a fair and neutral panel, and then he can move on. Because litigation in this regard wouldn't, if the parties can't figure it out on their own, litigation takes years, it costs tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just not an effective avenue for resolving these types of conflicts, because sports move too quickly. There's a reason why all pro sports have implemented these types of grievance procedures, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, in more detail as we go.
Absolutely, Anna. Bryce has been very thorough, as he often is. So I'll ask you a slightly different version of a similar question, and that is, in this instance, and obviously from a European perspective, had Corey, for example, approached you about whether or not he was able to or right to, which I guess is a strange word to use in this particular instance. I think I'll stick with able to, remove himself from the agreement for whatever reason, and in light of the threats that were made, what would you have advised him? How would you have facilitated him kind of getting out of that situation, if indeed you were able to?
Okay, so you don't mean due to this payment issues, but later after Rotterdam has threatened him? Well, that's actually a good question. First, when it comes to those contract issues, they're pretty similar over here, I guess. It's very complicated how you even would identify the kind of contract an LCS player has. If he's an employee, then a whole other set of rules dominates the whole process, and when you fight about it. And when it comes to this Rotterdam situation, it's hard, this is a risky process. And to me, it seems it's right now, without having a grievance process or anything, it's all about leverage. And the player, as the weakest element, he doesn't have any leverage. I've read those Sky blogs you posted, and it's all about this, how we spin this, with the Riot PR thing. And to me, it seems right. So how would I advise him? Actually hard for a player to advise him to contact Riot, what he did, and to look for a solution together with Riot. But the outcome, as we've discussed, is kind of...
I think you've just cut out there, actually, Anna, for me. Oh, no, there you are. You are back. Sorry, I just... You cut out there. The last word we heard was riot, which, again, quite appropriate for this type of show. But so do continue. You said if the player were to contact Riot?
Yeah, the player contacted Riot, and I thought that was the right thing to do. Because as Bryce pointed out, if you try to take this to court, which you can, and to me as a lawyer, it's always interesting, to get someone his right and to fight it out in court. But this is a long process. These players, they have, such a short amount of time to seize their opportunities. You can't go to court and drag this out over 2 years or even longer. So I would advise not to do it, to resolve it in a short amount of time, to get involved the main player here, Riot. But as we've stated, and I think this leads to something very important. You can't get around. Riot has a certain responsibility towards those players, I think. Because
Sorry,
we should help them in situations like this. Of course, I can help you.
No, I was going to say that they did contact Riot, and I was going to ask you both about this, whether you thought the response from Riot was kind of in line with what you would expect, because we saw an email from Nick Allen where he said, don't worry, we're going to look into this. Your well-being is the priority, I believe was the quote. And then a week later, nothing had happened other than the player having to return to MYM. I find that very strange. It doesn't seem that Riot actually did a lot to suggest that the player's well-being was indeed the priority. What are your assessments of how Riot reacted in light of being told everything that had happened?
Well, I mean, when it comes to... Sorry.
No, go for it, Anna.
Well, when it comes to finding the well-being, what does it mean? Being physically unharmed? Well, congratulations. They should make sure of that. But
it's not good. We shouldn't laugh,
I would rather... No, we shouldn't laugh. I mean, this is a really serious thing. But, I mean, to me, well-being would seem more like making sure that your career is still happening, that your procedures just to resolve the solution. Sorry, I'm cut out again. I'm really sorry.
Well, it's okay. We'll be able to resolve that. I think we'll see if we swapping out your video for the picture increases the bandwidth, because while you are indeed very appealing to look at, it is the words I would say are the most important thing here. Yes, I am incredibly smooth, I know. So Bryce, while we get that resolved, Sam's going to work on that for Anna. Let's just bring you in here, and again, it's the same question. Do we feel that Riot's actions were sufficient in this instance? Because certainly I'm looking at the evidence, and I don't really see what they've done that actually benefits the player at all. And perhaps I'm missing something.
Well, it's a really, really complex situation, and I try my hardest not to kind of armchair judge these situations from looking at the actual ruling. One, because I think it's more productive to figure out how procedurally and from a structural level we can get better about this as we go on. And two, because just from my own personal experience, right, I've had the unique opportunity to work on a number of these cases behind the scene. And I get the sense, because of some great journalism from yourself and from a good reporter, Jacob, over at Esports Heaven, that a lot of this came to light. But I'm not comfortable saying that 100% of it came to light, or that we're working with the exact same set of information as Riot is. And in my experience, what has been made public is usually not actually that close to 100%. So even if we might be closer here, I'm still a little weary on that. So with the annoying lawyer caveat aside, right? It's
you're doing a great job, Bryce.
Why,
really.
thank you. Why, thank you. Yeah, no, this is all they teach you in law school, is how to waffle before answering the question. So it's one of those things where I look at it from Riot's perspective and I see a ton of legal complexity, right? I mean, they're trying to work out whether or not a contract has been breached by Corey, whether or not it's been breached by MYM, what the implications of those breaches might be. They're trying to, figure out what their own legal liability is for this. You will be
Bryce,
certain.
Can I ask you something? Why do they try to figure out if there is a breach or not? I mean, I don't see why this is an issue at all for Riot. I mean, it's not the civil court who determines if there is a breach or not.
I think the answer to that, Anna, is because when you put yourself in Riot's shoes on a moment like this, they have two choices, right? They can either let's say they choose not to try to figure out whether there's been any breach, right? Without the type of grievance procedures we have in place, essentially what Riot does is going to be final, right? So in the sense of if they say we're not going to figure out whether or not there's been a breach, Corey, you're free to do whatever you want. You could go play for another LCS team. You could go play for a Challenger Series team. You could play for whoever you want to. Right? Then all of a sudden, you're going to have a bunch of kids in the league, or at any level, saying, "Oh, well, I can just walk away, and then it'll get resolved later. I'm just going to say that there was a breach of contract, and I want to move on." And so you could have a disaster, right? I mean, it could really hurt the structural integrity of the league and what Riot has fought really hard for, which is to kind of transform this into professional sports, to have that level of consistency for its brand from a sponsorship perspective. So you could see why, from Riot's perspective, it would be really problematic to just say, okay, you say there's a breach, we're not going to figure it out, you go do what you want, we're not going to stand in your way. And so that's why. But then you go at this from the exact opposite perspective. Let's say Riot does adjudicate, right? Or let's say they don't adjudicate, but they say, which I think is what they would say they're going to do, which is, we're not going to adjudicate whether or not there's been a breach, but we're not going to let you play for anyone else until you two have worked it out, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's equally problematic. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's an equally problematic stance, because what winds up happening is exactly what happened here, right? I mean, it's a little murky from some of the information that's been made public about whether Riot said you can't play for anyone else, or you can play for a Challenger Series team but not an LCS team. Whatever it was, it seems like Riot was making some restrictions on, okay, maybe there was a breach, maybe there wasn't a breach. We're going to prohibit you from playing elsewhere until we figure this out. And that's the situation. You basically forced Corey's hand into going back into a situation in which he stated he felt unsafe. And so it's really not a good situation either way. And that's the real heart of this problem, right? It's not whether or not Riot got it right or got it wrong, but the fact that structurally how all this process works really fails both sets of parties. Because you could envision a hypothetical in which there hasn't been any wrongdoing on the behalf of an organization. The organization just isn't doing very well, and a young star player who's under contract there for multiple years wants to walk away. And Riot can't just let that happen freely, but the inverse is the Corey situation, and that's also very problematic.
My feeling was, though, and again, I don't think I was alone in this, but I am certainly open to the suggestion that this is a misinterpretation on my part. But my feeling when I looked at the ruling, and indeed the way Riot handled themselves throughout, was Riot had made a very clear statement about who they prioritize first, and its organizations over individual players. I don't know if you are inclined to agree with that, but that's really how it felt to me, just based on the way the whole thing was handled from start to finish, ultimately.
I mean, but what would you have expected if the player's interest is, put above all? What kind of behavior would you have expected, Richard?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask that question, because unfortunately, the way I watch Riot behave as a games company, I think it's unprecedented. I find them very strange, and I use the term cultish to describe their activities. Their business practices have more in line with the Church of Scientology than any other games company that I've ever seen operate. And I absolutely do not say that lightly. That as an entity, they are very... anyone who has anything to do with their game, they will look to either bully, bribe, or coerce. But ultimately, they're the three methods of control they elect to use. And that's been my experience with them firsthand. That's been the experience of talking to journalists, talking to players. Everybody says the same thing. Riot will find a way to control you. And that's ultimately why we have so few people that are independent of Riot that still pass judgment about League of Legends. And again, we'll get onto that a little bit more. And this is why people like yourself coming into this scene, for me, are vitally important. But what I would have expected immediately would have been, okay, we're going to, by all means, leave the gaming house. I think that's a good idea. We're not going to make a definitive ruling about whether you can or can't play for another team. We're not going to impede your movement. We're not going to impede your employment in that fashion until we've ascertained all the facts. We'd advise you not to commit to anything just yet. But rest assured, we will investigate this, and we will do so in a quick fashion. And then at the point where it became abundantly clear that the player had indeed been threatened, for me, if I was Riot and I was controlling every little facet in the league, that's got to be the point where you make a stand and you go, you know what, then as far as we're concerned, we would allow that player to have freedom of movement. You've overstepped the boundary. We are not recognizing, your right to bind that player to this team, and perhaps they can't do anything in line with the contract that MYM have in place with the player, but they can certainly do something about the contract they've got in place with MYM. What I instead saw from Riot was, don't worry, Mr. Player, we're going to conduct an investigation. They spoke with the organization and they basically strategized how to minimize the PR damage caused by the player's movement and then hoped it wouldn't go public. I don't really consider that in line with player welfare. So that's to answer your question, Anna, what I would have done is pretty much completely different to what Riot actually did.
Yeah.
But what I expected is pretty much what I got.
Yeah, I mean, the problem you have, the way it is constructed now with the application of LCS rules on the one hand, and then you have on the other hand, like the legal world, like the real legal world outside governing the contracts between the player and the organization and so on. So, I mean, to be fair, the esports team is not a judge, like a formal judge. This is not a legal procedure. This is something that is conducted within a contractual construct, right? So I think this is also what is. That's about it. So the ruling, and that's it. So that's end of story. But I mean, this is just one little part of the story. This is the LCS part and their power they have through the athlete, what they can do. They can issue penalties towards entities who are bound. Is Rotterdam even bound by the LCS rules? Because I was under the impression he is not bound by it because he's not the general manager, but he got this ban. Of course, LCS can de facto, enforce this ban because it's their league. But it's interesting to me because it seems there's no real legal connection, right?
Yes. Yeah. So just jump in. There actually is. So I've done work, and yeah, I mean, so the agreements, I'm trying to figure out how to put this vaguely, the agreements between Riot and the teams that participate in the league do enforce basically upon the business entities that enter into them to bind. Yeah, right. To bind all of, like, basically every, all their employees, all their affiliates to do a bunch of things, including follow the LCS rules.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's certainly, so they would have like jurisdictional reach to the extent the LCS rules are creating jurisdiction, just vis-a-vis the contracts.
Yeah, I mean, the issue would arise when someone would with the team and in the LCS would like to employ that Rotterdam person. And if Riot could force that team to not enter a contract with him. But I mean, of course, if anybody is enforced to abide to those rules, it's legally quite obvious what the answer would be. Okay, so thank you. Yeah.
So just to kind of talk a little bit more, and then we'll move on to some broader topics. But just about this Corey MYM situation, I feel it's a watershed moment in League of Legends for quite a lot of reasons. And I've known for a long time that this is unfortunately the tip of the iceberg. For whatever reason, in the court of public opinion, it seems to be with the League of Legends community specifically, but it is an esports problem. You don't just have balance of probability when it comes to evidence. Though if this story had been reported without the recording, no one would have believed it. It would have been, largely dismissed. None of us would be having this conversation. Riot wouldn't have made a ruling. It would have just been another example of a player being treated poorly by management, and esports is replete with examples of that. But because that this has been made such a big deal of, it was reported in the mainstream gaming press, it was picked up by people like PC Gamer, Kotaku, and numerous other publications. We're now at a stage where I think we've got to say, like, as I said earlier, a touchstone where, right, player welfare is something that's on Riot's radar, even if even if we all agree they haven't necessarily handled it in the best way possible. And it's going to be an issue that we need to get right moving forward. So what long-term lessons do we take from this Corey case? What have we actually learned? Are players now in a better position after this incident has been so highly publicized, or are they in a worse position because, maybe organizations will be a lot clever about the way they exploit their players?
Personally, I don't think that they're in a better or worse position right now. I think that I completely agree with everything you just described, that this is potentially a watershed moment, and it's really important to make sure that we're growing from this, learning from this, and getting it right the next time around. And by getting it right, I do not mean the decision. I mean the structure surrounding the decision. How, what are the processes and how do we improve them? Maybe it's improved to the standpoint of it's another really public scandal, and I feel like within league esports, at least, scandals have become less common. Scandals of this nature have become less common to the point where maybe players have forgotten some of kind of the roots of the LCS and before the LCS, where they were very common. And so, it might highlight the need to get individual level representation, both when disputes arise, but also before, when you're entering into your contract, to make sure that the terms make sense and to make sure that you can talk these types of things through. So if a bad situation happens, you do have explicit rights in your contract to be able to walk away. So, the individual representation is definitely part of this, and maybe bringing these issues back to the fore helps, cement that in players' brains. Okay, the next time around I sign a contract, I'm going to make sure that I'm talking to some attorney or some business person or someone who can give me thoughtful feedback on this. And then the second part of this, and this is what really remains to be seen, and I've written a lot about this and pulled Anna into that discussion, and she's written a lot about it too, is, can we use this as a stepping stone for real dialogue about how to improve the LCS rules, to make sure that when these types of situations happen, they can be resolved quickly, cheaply, and fairly. And that mechanism, it exists. It exists in every pro sport, right? I mean, there's a reason why they have all chosen unilaterally, at least in the US, like the NBA, MLB, NFL, MLS, they all have a similar dispute resolution process for when teams and but when players and teams have any kind of issue. It could be something like this. It could be a salary or some interpretation of the contract, free agency rights. It could be anything. But the point is, sports move too quickly for litigation. Litigation is also really expensive, and so what's happened in all these pro sports is the parties have come together and said it's better for all of us if, when these types of conflicts arise, we can resolve them quickly. And here's the type of procedure we want to put in place. Now, there's a complexity here, the elephant in the room, and the question I've gotten most commonly on Reddit and Twitter, probably since I've been writing about this over the last week or so, has been, why would Riot do this? Why would they bother? Because, while the teams and players have a solid reason for wanting these types of disputes to be resolved quickly and cheaply, and while they could be forward-thinking and thinking, that it's a good idea, Riot has full control right now. It doesn't have to be fully transparent. It can make the rulings based solely on its interests. Part of that, I do genuinely believe part of it is player well-being. I just think player well-being gets thrown into the mix with business reasons and litigation risk and PR concerns, right? We could go on and on about the complexities from Riot's perspective about how to make these types of decisions. And so, the question is, would Riot step back and say, I think that this is a holistic good for the scene, and we should implement it, and be willing to cede some of our control and figure out a way to make sure we're a crucial player in the fact-finding process, in the decision-making process, but we're not doing it under the exclusively under the auspices of Riot. We're going to create some kind of neutral arbitration body to fact-find and adjudicate these disputes. Or, in the event that Riot isn't willing to do that, are players and teams going to use this as kind of a catalyst moment to come together and say, the system doesn't work for us when disputes arise. We don't know exactly what disputes there are going to be, but we certainly know that there are going to be disputes. And let's talk about what type of system we want to see in place, and then approach Riot collectively and say, hey, this we view this as an issue. We looked at the Corey MYM situation and we didn't like the way in which it was handled, not from a decision, ultimate decision perspective, just from a structural perspective. And let's engage in open dialogue about how to improve that and try to collectively leverage Riot into maybe ceding some of that control for the betterment of the scene as a whole.
Anna, so just some final thoughts from you, and then I think we'll take a quick break because the conversation has nicely moved towards what you wrote about today on the Daily Dot, which we'll discuss in the second half of the show. But ultimately, what do you take away from the Corey and MYM situation, and how do you think it's going to change the landscape of League of Legends as we know it?
Well, first of all, I would like to give a nice story about German law and sports law and how German authorities and judges see this issue. Because usually sports law is seen as an independent law in Germany that is not governed by state rules. So you can't take it to court, right? So, but most recently, our administrative courts decided if there is an obvious breach of rule of reason, the way you approach things in your sports rulings, an administrative court has to weigh in and has to say, look, you cannot do your ruling the way you do it. It was about something with doping and the way they did it. And the administrative court just said, okay, it's not okay the way you did it. So this could be a threat on other kind of sports, even esports, who knows? But I'm just saying this process is not without limits. It's not without limits by the state, but also by all the stakeholders. And I appreciated, the speech, Bryce's speech, very much, because it led smoothly to the topic. So what can players actually do? Is this the pivotal moment we all waited for, that they could, get together and force a representation of their interests here?
Okay, so what we'll do is, at that juncture, we'll put the Corey and MYM thing to bed, and we'll take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about this player unionization that you've just alluded to, Anna. In particular, Snoopy. I've got a few points I definitely want to raise about that. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about this article that you wrote for the Daily Dot today, Anna. Now, I'm sure Sam will bring it up on screen while I'm talking about it. I've trained him incredibly well. It's almost Pavlovian. It's incredible. But Anna wrote an article called "The LCS Needs a Grievance Committee to Review Its Rulings." And indeed, for those that aren't aware, and perhaps you've not thought too much about it, when Riot passed their rulings upon people that they govern, people who are in their LCS league, there is no appeals process whatsoever. The rule stands, and as Bryce has described it in the past, they literally are the judge, the jury, and the executioner more often than not. So it's a great read. I had the pleasure of reading it earlier today before we put it up. Anna even did the diagram. She even did the picture that's in it. A lovely flowchart, and you did incredibly well. I haven't seen anything that good and that fetching since my PowerPoint presentations when I was at university. So congratulations.
That's a questionable compliment. Thank you very much. You know what? I tried my best, so thank you.
No, my media and journalism degree. It must be really touching for you to know that is right up there with your PhD and everything else. So, what a great day for you, I'm sure. But anyway, it's a great read. I urge you to go over to Daily Dot and give it a quick skim read. If you're a fast reader, you'll have 5 minutes to do it now. I'm timing you while we take a quick break. So we'll see you afterwards, where we're going to talk about all of those things I just mentioned. See you soon. everyone, and welcome back to this special First Blood, which, as I said, we were going to call Legal Legends if Travis hadn't kind of intimated he might be doing something similar. Sam suggested Law of the League. I think that's a bit rubbish, so we'll try and think of something a bit better for when we do this type of show again. I'm sure there will be cause to. But anyway, it's a special. We're not going to be doing our usual irreverent banter and talking about the games and transfer gossip that we do. There is indeed no Josh, no Ram. I have instead got with me two lawyers. Bryce, who we've of course met before.
Everyone's worst nightmare.
Yeah, no, I'm the only guy brave enough to do it. And the lovely Anna from Germany. Both specialists in their field, which we mentioned earlier. So let's move on to the next topic. Today, Anna presented to me what I thought was a great read. I had no hesitation in passing it on to my editor straight away at the Daily Dot, and that was the reasons why the LCS needs a grievance committee to review its rulings. As we mentioned just before the break, Riot, when they put these penalties in place, there is no appeals process. What they say absolutely goes, and they do the fact-finding. They make the decisions when it comes to the penalties. They exert the penalties, and there's no one to turn to if you're not satisfied with that outcome or resolution, which is quite unlike most sports. So, Anna, as you wrote the article, tell us a little bit about your thoughts surrounding why Riot needs a grievance committee, as you call it, and tell us why it's so important that they do go in that direction.
Well, first off, I think it has to be made clear that this idea of a grievance committee is a little different from when Bryce talks about an arbitration process. Because arbitration process could mean you discuss any kind of legal dispute that comes up within the LCS. And what I suggest here is, well, in comparison to that, kind of a baby step, but still I think, well, from the perspective of Riot, it is huge. So I just put it out there, to create some discussion and to take a stand and see what comes out of it. Well, I thought about the nature of LCS rulings and how they impact actually the entities in the LCS, especially players. And what happens is they're not happy with the ruling, or let's put it that way, or they just don't feel as protected as they should be. And as you said, they don't have anywhere to turn to. And what I thought would be a great solution to have some kind of appeal process to a grievance committee where you could involve actually the stakeholders of the scene. Because this is actually how it works in this non-state sphere, right? You involve stakeholders. In this case, it's the players, the teams, Riot. I would hope for lawyer to improve the quality of these rulings from a legal point of view. I mean, you can do it without it, but I think it would be better. And actually, what that usually creates is much more acceptance amongst the involved parties. So I've read on Reddit when I suggested this. Yeah, well, the community is not going to accept it anymore because of the grievance committee or whatsoever. So people, this is not about, your acceptance. We have something in Germany, we call it the Wutbürger, which is, people who go on the street and protest against anything. And even if they're involved in the process, they're never happy. So this is not about you. This is about the player, the team, who wants to see the interests being protected. And this is, this grievance process, it's all about that.
So Bryce, Anna's already said there, it's a little bit different to things that we've talked about before in other shows. But certainly I am familiar with, British sports, and I've even been to a grievance committee during my time as a rugby player. When
What did you do?
How did that go? Did you do anything? Did you hurt
No,
someone?
I absolutely did. I hit somebody. I assaulted somebody during a game of rugby. Which, you know, I mean, you can. It's very hard to discern what's assault and what isn't in rugby.
An assault during
exactly.
Yeah.
But I crossed a threshold within the rules, and I received a very sizable ban, and I went to an appeals committee and had my ban reduced. It was a very strange formal affair, I must say. I had there was a dress code. You had to have a shirt and tie. The tie had to belong to the club, which you were, you know, contractually bound to play for. It was all a very strange ceremony about it, and you know, there was three older gentlemen that sat on the rugby union board, and they went over the specifics of the case, and I had to show contrition. Which was a big part of it. I had to show remorse and say, yes, perhaps I shouldn't have hit that individual. And they reduced my sentence to a 6-week ban as opposed to a full rest of season ban for the club. So I've been to them, and I was very grateful at the time that one existed. Even though looking back at my younger self, I acknowledge I had actually... I was in the wrong. There was no doubt about it.
You deserved it, right?
Yeah, so I definitely deserved some action against me, but I did feel at the time that actually they'd gone a little bit too far with the ban. It was unprecedented due to the nature of my reaction. So I think, Bryce, you know, having been a beneficiary of these things in the past, I can absolutely see why it's very important that they exist. And that we shouldn't necessarily allow one organization to effectively say, this is the decision, this is the penalty, and there is absolutely no recourse for that. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. You and I touched on this a little bit the last time I was on the show, at the very end, kind of talking through why we have appeals processes, just generally speaking, right, at a, you know, legal philosophical level, that it's good to have a check on the initial decision maker, to have kind of an independent body who can review the case and analyze it, and, you know, pass judgment one way or the other about whether or not the decision was right or wrong. And I think what Anna's highlighting, it is fundamentally different, right? We're talking about an appeals process versus the initial dispute resolution. And so, I think both are absolutely necessary. I want to see an appeals process in place for decisions. I don't think that all LCS decisions are going to get appealed, but there are some that come up that I think would benefit from a legal legitimacy perspective to have that avenue available. And then quite separately, you've got the kind of I guess we'll call it the trial court level, right? The initial decision maker, the fact finder, the person who interviews the parties, that collects the record, and basically determines what happened and then passes judgment. And that process needs to be improved as well. I mean, that's, it's really the first phase of this, not the second phase of this, that gets implicated by everything we were discussing in the first half of the show. When you look at the MYM Corey situation, a lot of the problem was in the fact finding, in whether or not there was kind of a structured process in place so that Corey knew when he felt like he was getting into a bad situation, as soon as it kind of went bad, who does he reach out to? How does he communicate his issues? And what happens from there, right? We need a process where you could file a formal grievance before whatever the dispute resolution body we would create is. They would then have 7 days or 5 days or however much time we want to allot to collect the facts, to interview all the parties. They're all required to make themselves available for this process. There would have to be some kind of an evidentiary collection rules. I spent a little bit of the past few days going through, and I painstakingly, boringly read the grievance and dispute resolution procedures for the NFL, MLB, and NBA. And they're all quite similar, right? They all have certain requirements about what evidence can and cannot be used. They all require you basically to disclose everything material. It puts an affirmative duty on the parties to explain exactly what happened. And if you don't disclose something, you're setting yourself up for potential sanctions down the road from the body. And you certainly can't use anything in the, we'll call it the arbitration process or the hearing, whatever hearing there is, to make the ultimate decision that you haven't disclosed. And so that's important. you figure out timing. How many weeks do we get to collect the information? How shortly thereafter is the actual hearing? You have to figure out how we're going to compose the panel, and that's something we could talk about, whether it's, someone from Riot, a player's representative, and a team representative. Obviously, you can't have people that are directly involved in the situation. There's a bunch of other, possibilities for this. I don't want to belabor kind of the specifics too much. But on a structural level, looking at Anna's article, which is kind of a follow-up piece on the Reddit post she made a few days ago, we're definitely in two different areas, right? One of them is this appellate, the secondary level of review. So we would have exactly what happened here. And then if one of the parties wanted to appeal, great. And then we have the appellate process in place. And then the other one is how do we handle it better or differently at the initial stage before Riot even issues this preliminary ruling. Obviously, Riot would have to be heavily involved with this, and they should be. It's their league. They're certainly an interested party, and maybe they're more neutral in the situation than the team or the player. Well, they definitely are because they're not directly implicated in the dispute. I would just like to see it be a more inclusive process, a more delineated process, so that the structure exists so that when you have a 17-year-old kid in what feels like a helpless position, he realizes he's not helpless, he knows exactly what to do, and he starts the ball rolling on that process.
Open question to both of you. If there was, if Riot, let's say they agreed to have a grievance committee or an appeal panel, whatever you want to call it, who should sit on it?
Yeah, well, actually, I wrote about it. I think it's quite clear that the stakeholders of the scene should be involved. Of course, you need to avoid any conflict of interest. So if you have a representative for players, you have one representative for teams, then you have a Riot official and a lawyer. No one of those can be involved in the matter at hand at all. So it needs to be a different Riot official from the one who issued the initial LCS ruling and so on. So you need to make sure of that. But other from that, I think it would be great to have every group of interest represented in that kind of panel. And I also think there was an important point Bryce made, and why I also wrote it. Why I researched this thing on the appeal level, because I think if you put it on the appeal level, you can avoid a lot of bureaucracy, right? Because there's some rulings out there, they're quite easy to understand. The facts at least seem clear, so you don't need this appeal process. You can avoid it. So, yeah.
I think the flip side of that, though, Anna, is that when you get into a situation like the Corey MYM situation, I honestly don't know which party would be appealing that decision. I think Corey is ready to put the whole thing behind him. This is just from the outside looking in, right? He's back. He's playing for the team. Whatever leverage is there. And MYM certainly isn't going to appeal this decision, right? I mean, they got, I think, on the lower spectrum of punishment from what was being considered. They had already fired the guy who was banned anyway, and so then basically it's a $5,000 fine. It's not a huge deal. So, you look at this situation, you say, would it be any different if we had an appeals process in place? My cat is going to get in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you point out
sorry.
I mean, you point out actually to a certain extent, the quality of the ruling, because somehow it settles everything and, well, not everything, but, issues are kind of resolved with this kind of ruling. So, yeah, you can move on. Good luck. Yeah.
Come on, Bryce.
Well,
Give me.
Sorry, I kind of missed that last part. What did I? I got a little distracted. My cat almost stepped on my computer.
It's okay. It's the internet. Cats will only our viewers will triple if we say there's a cat on the stream. But anyway, sorry, Bryce. Do continue with the point you were making.
No. I want to know what Anna's point was. I'm more than happy to respond to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that actually, when you look at the LCS ruling, the point you make here is quite valid. What Riot actually accomplished is to resolve the issue, not to resolve it while honoring all the interests that are at stake, I would say, but somehow they resolved it, right? So it's from a PR point of view, it was quite nicely done. So
well, it's always honestly from Riot's perspective, it's always quite nicely done because they tend to kind of split the baby on these decisions, and because of the power dynamics, the parties kind of naturally fall in line regardless of how controversial their ultimate conclusion is. But I mean, yeah, I think the ruling they reached here, resulted in some public outcry. The parties kind of just were like, all right, we're fine, we're moving on from this. And that's the point, right? Is that part one of Riot's big interests in this is PR for its league and making sure these disputes go away quickly. And so it doesn't necessarily lead to, like you're talking about, a full and fair ruling on the merits of what happened. It leads to why don't we just put you both back in your corners and we can all move on together because really this is bad for everybody.
So here's another question, and this for me is perhaps the most important question in regards to this issue. I agree with both of you. I think we need to have an appeals panel, a grievance committee. I think Riot will do all they can to resist having that put in place for obvious reasons, because Riot have created this product. And what we need to remember is, for all Riot want to call LCS and League of Legends a sport, which we know why they do that. It's not just about legitimacy. There's actually very good legal reasons for doing so when it comes to contracts that they have with players. And not only that, there's funding and sponsorship issues surround being clearly defined as a sport. But that's a completely different show. Now, the Riot will resist anyone coming in and effectively removing their control from what is effectively, it's all one big advertisement for their game. It's a marketing exercise. We're all invested in it. We all care about it. We all support these teams and these organizations. But effectively, it is a platform through which to advertise. That's the whole thing from the ground up. So they will naturally want to resist anything that could impact on it going in the direction they want it to, which a grievance committee and an appeals panel absolutely would. So, using your knowledge of the law and using your knowledge of sporting examples, is there any way in which Riot could be compelled and effectively forced from a legal perspective to adopt a grievance committee or appeals panel into their body?
So the short answer is yes. If we're looking for legal compulsion, then we're talking unionization, right? We're talking about a body that Riot is actually, according to U.S. law, obligated to negotiate with and to collectively bargain with. They would put, as one of the key issues, they would say, this is something we want to talk about, and they would try to legally leverage Riot into complying and instituting it. And if Riot, as we've seen throughout the history of professional sports, if there's a true sticking point issue, and I don't know if this would be one or not, but assuming Riot absolutely did not want to do this, if you unionize, you have the power to strike, you have the power to lock out, right? There are certain economic weapons that are legally granted to unions in the United States through the National Labor Relations Act. And this is something you and I have talked about in the past, and it's also something I've given quite a bit of thought to. I've written a white paper on collective bargaining in esports and how that would work, and I think one of my significant conclusions on that is everyone is quick to jump to unionization as an option, and I get why. It's legally powerful and it's something we can all access. Everyone in their lives has had some form of interaction with a union, or is at least aware of what that they exist and what role they play. But if you look at the history of professional sports, it didn't go from creation of the sport to unionization of the players like that. It was an evolving process, and one of the historical realities of sports is before players all got together and unionized, they all got together and talked and put together a statement of players' interests or a statement of players' rights, and they went and talked to the powers that be. And while they weren't unionized and they couldn't legally compel their employers, the league, to change these things, what they discovered was if we all act as one, we're more powerful than if we all act separately. Even though we haven't formally unionized, there is power in leverage, and leverage is created in numbers. And I think that's a really important point, because if we're talking about, assuming hypothetically Riot's not, listening in and writing down everything we say and is going to go and, implement this process next week, it's not like the players have to formally unionize and take that giant, expensive, complex legal hurdle in order to affect some form of change, whether it's this or anything else. I mean, Richard, last time I was on the show, we talked about a lot of things that I would like to see changed in the rules. And any rule, whatever point the players or the teams, whether collectively or separately, whatever they're most interested in changing, if they're all on the same page about it and they're communicating to Riot with one voice, I promise you they will be more effective than if they're trying to do it all separately in a haphazard fashion.
Anna, then, so we're Europeans.
What a frame.
Yeah, interesting thoughts on this topic. Yeah.
Here we go. So to divide and conquer, that's what we're going to do here, Anna. Now, because we're Europeans, I think we have a very different attitude, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, Bryce, a very different attitude towards unions and unionization. Certainly, I grew up in a mining town. The unions effectively went to war with the government, to prevent pit closures and that kind of thing under the Thatcher, I guess what you would call an administration, when we had the lovely Margaret Thatcher in charge. I know, obviously, in Germany as well, still got some very strong trade union presences. They haven't been completely eradicated, and we actually can still bring about forcible, meaningful change, in the political landscape in both of our countries. Now, I don't know, again, if because it kind of feels to me like when I visit America and when I talk to my American friends and colleagues, kind of feels like unionization and unions don't quite have the same pull in America as maybe they did once upon a time, and certainly not to the same degree that they still have in Europe. So just for a point of education, short answer, is that correct?
Short answer? God, no, I don't think so.
Actually, I would disagree with what you've said from the European perspective, certainly from the British perspective, right? Because, I mean, this whole Thatcher experience, that must be horrible to the whole country. But, I mean, this is probably England specific. So, well, probably, of course, you have this in certain areas all over Europe, this kind of fighting, but it also has been, at least, it has been a long time, and this kind of, politicization and unionization of a certain group, I don't think it has this strong meaning. I mean, I have this other expression that it is rather an American thing, like, okay, let's get a union and then we have the rights and then we force them to do so. Because to me, it is rather like, okay, let's lobby this idea of player protection, create some discussion and get the players to wrap their heads around this idea that they could get together for their, presentation of interests, but not like, okay, unite to enforce, your opinion of justice on Riot.
So back to you, Bryce, because I want to be educated on this, and I know you've written so much about unions and in particular sports unions, but I mean, I know it kind of feels, that there's almost a bit of a stigma attached to unions in America, that they're almost perceived to be sometimes like tangentially criminal, in their associations. And it's one of these interesting differences between our two kind of cultures. So again, just because it's off the topic completely, but just for my own personal information, if you could sort of give me a summary, is that an accurate interpretation, speaking as a ignorant European person looking out across the Atlantic?
I think I think that it is and it isn't. I think unions still play an important and ongoing role in American politics and American society. But I do think that we have, speaking from a a political spectrum perspective, right? We tend to be more conservative as a country than do a lot of European countries. And just from a governmental policy, philosophy of government, role of government perspective, et cetera. And so you definitely have that push where unions are bad for the free market. You don't need, the market will take care of you on an individual level, et cetera. I mean, the stigma absolutely exists in the U.S. I'm weary to paint the whole country with a broad brush on this. But I think it's...
Again, we're not quite aware of the size of America. I mean, again, so I'm on a tiny little island right now that would probably fit several times into your smallest state, I imagine. Sure. But so yes, we certainly are generalizing and by quite some distance.
Yeah, I think your characterization on a broad scale is fair. Though I will say there are very active unions in the U.S. That do a lot of good, and depending on where you fall on the political spectrum and how you feel about this, there are very passionate union supporters in the U.S., and then you're going to have some passionate people on the other side, and maybe there are more people on the other side of that question than there might be in the UK.
So, with all of that in mind, I'm going to bring Snoopy into this. The ex-player who was one of the bright shining British stars in LCS history, and yeah, Scottish we have to say now. I mean, I still think of us as all British, but I guess and the devolution vote wasn't successful. But I will say he is specifically Scottish, and I've always had a great rapport and a great respect with Stephen because we're from very similar backgrounds. Very similar working class upbringings, and this is probably why unionization strikes such a chord with him, because we were all raised back in the times of the great strikes, the miners' strike, the council tax riots. These were times when the working class actually could stand up for themselves and did have a voice that changed the political landscape of Britain indefinitely and indelibly as well. But he has said, and this is where I do find this a little bit perplexing, that he doesn't feel that League of Legends is ready for a player union. I was hoping to get him on the show to clarify this, but he's unable to come on, sadly, at the moment. But it does seem to me quite strange, because I'm looking at League of Legends and I'm thinking, actually, with the game being so big and so much money being involved and it being so important, this absolutely would be the time to unionize. And the issues haven't got less frequent in regards to player welfare, player rights. They've become more frequent, almost as if, more money, more problems was an accurate mantra. So, therefore, I have to say...
The future teller, Notorious B.I.G.
Indeed. Yeah. Rest in peace. But I feel unionization now would be the time to do it. I absolutely think we need it more than ever right now. So, Anna, yes, jump in.
I think that unionization, apart from question of how to structure it, finance it, and so on, this has to be something that comes from the player base, right? They need to actually move together and create some kind of union. It's not something you can enforce on them and say, see, this is the moment you should act. Just do something. This is something they have to do for themselves. And right now, I feel like, okay, so we're on the way. Players, I think that they need to be more cautious when it comes to their interests, how to protect them. But actually, I agree when it comes to we're not quite there yet. There needs to be some kind of political moment, I guess. We're lacking that.
Well, Bryce has talked about this, these flashpoints, these polarizing issues. What's it going to take then? It's a serious question, because if the Corey instance isn't it, and we know that riot, I mean, the level of control that they exercise over their players is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I mean, we all remember the instance where they even tried to tell players what they could and couldn't stream on their individual Twitch streams, Twitch channels, which they own exclusively. It's nothing to do with Riot whatsoever. And sure, they retracted that, but it wasn't for the want of trying. We know that players are really heavily censored in what they can and can't say. I've had this problem numerous times when I try to get people to come onto my show for a candid interview, and they say, I can't do it, Richard. Riot will have my guts for garters if I was to come onto your show and talk honestly about this. So with all of these sanctions and expectations and controls that are put on players, what's it going to take for players to just get together behind the scenes and say, you know what? We are the people that actually hold the cards in this particular game.
So I think when I look at this, and I've talked to Steven about this a decent amount offline too. I know him pretty well just because he's so vocal on these issues and I'm pretty vocal on these issues. I agree with Steven and I agree with Anna that this is not the right moment. And I don't think that we're missing the catalyst event. I think that if the MYM Corey situation were to, the identical situation were to arise again in, I don't know how long, 2 years, I'm picking an arbitrary number, but, bear with me for the purpose of this. If it were to happen in 2 years, maybe that would be the catalyst point for unionization. What we lack now isn't the scandal, the big problem that becomes public, that makes everyone aware of the issues. What we lack is kind of the economics surrounding the game to support it. So we don't, it is the biggest esport of all time from a numbers perspective and from a monetary perspective, but that doesn't mean it's big enough necessarily to support a union, right? I mean, you've got at the peak of the LCS, you've got players making a couple $100,000. This is just salaries, right? And then the bottom, you're still making close to the Riot minimum. All told, streaming and sponsorships and everything like that, there are LCS pros making quite a bit of money, and it's awesome. And you also have LCS pros who don't have particularly popular streams, whose teams don't generate tons of sponsorship revenue. They generate basically enough to get by, to support the gaming house, and to give them a small salary. The union requires significant upfront funding and ongoing funding, right? You have to have people staffing the union. You have to have lawyers who work for the union as representatives so that they're available whenever. It's an ongoing organization that everyone has to pay into in order for it to work. And while the LCS and League might be closer than any sport has ever come before, I don't necessarily think we're at the point where it makes sense. And this is also, the other part of it is a consciousness issue spanning across all the players. I mean, the number of big-time LCS players who sign contracts without ever having an attorney look at it is pretty staggering. Yeah. So, in order for them to get on board with unionization, I feel like the individual level representation is maybe the easier thing to wrap your head around, and then it evolves over time. And if I've become a historian of professional sports just because I think it's so fascinating to compare the histories of pro sports to where esports, are now, and I think we can learn a lot, and I think we miss out without looking at that. And what you see in those histories is, a moment like the MYM Corey situation might propel discussion forward, and it might make players actually come together and have a conversation and say, hey, this is a real problem. We probably don't want to unionize yet because it's really expensive. It's legally complex. But why not put something in place that could be a stepping stone? And I've written about, and you and I've talked about before, this representative system, which I just like to use as an example because I think it's really low-hanging fruit, quite frankly, where all the teams could, captains from teams could get together. They would, that you would elect a representative from each team, and they would just come together, maybe if it's only during the off-season, maybe once or twice in off-season or once a month or however often they want to do it, and have these conversations. And I think that the situation we're in right now, the MYM Corey situation, might be a catalyst for that type of dialogue. I hope that it is. I'm certainly getting more conversations, on social media about these topics than ever before, and probably more importantly, behind the scenes from clients asking me, what do you think about this, or how, can we talk about this a little bit more? I read, I went back and read your article. It's interesting. What do you think about, is now the right moment? So I can tell you firsthand, those conversations are starting to kind of foment among the professional class. How widespread it is, I don't know. I mean, there's probably a self-selection bias, right? The players that have reached out to me are probably, for individual help in the past, are also probably the most in tune with these types of issues. And so whether, I wouldn't say that just from talking to my clients about it, it's necessarily a representative sample of the LCS as a whole, and whether or not all the players are looking at this and saying, hey, this is a bad situation, but whatever, it's not us, or whether they're looking at it and saying, hey, this is a bad situation, I really need to focus on the spring split right now, but when it's over, let's not forget this, let's put a pin in this, and let's come back and let's, really come together and maybe talk about, structurally what went wrong here and how this could absolutely happen to any of us, and it could. And let's figure out a way to kind of get together and communicate that to Riot and see if we can't push through some changes, shy of unionization, but still acting as one collective force.
So here's another question. It's kind of the opposite to the one that I asked about the appeals panel, and that is obviously I've been told privately by Riot staff, by LCS players, by numerous people who have this relationship with the League of Legends, at the highest level, that Riot actively dissuade unionization. They do not want it to happen. They have had talks internally about what they will do when that moment does come, and from what I'm told, it's not necessarily going to be a positive one for the players. There will be some some clashes surrounding the issue, which I guess we all anticipated anyway. So could Riot refuse to recognize any form of attempts to unionize by players, and could they actually, within the terms outlined in an LCS contract, penalize the players for attempting to strong-arm the company that effectively pays a significant portion of their wages?
Not in Germany. I don't know about the US, but not in Germany. Because
well, tell us why not in Germany, Anna. Why couldn't they do it in Germany?
I mean, these rights to unionize, to bargain, these are rights that are highly protected by, I guess, by any kind of democratic constitution out there. This is an integral part of democracy, and there's no way around it, even not for Riot. And if that would happen, they could not prevent it. On the other hand, of course, I would have been surprised if they had never thought about the possibility and to prepare for it, to protect their interests in some kind of collective bargaining process. I would expect this, and I also think it's quite all right to protect your interests as a company. So, yeah.
So it's an interesting kind of position to straddle, but Anna says there that she believes under the European, and again, obviously we need to remember that Riot exists in two, continents, and are bound by, European law and obviously, and specifically German law with their studio in Berlin, I believe it is, and obviously the California law in North America. So is it different on American soil? Could they prevent unionization?
So it comes down to a fundamental question about whether or not the players are employees or independent contractors of Riot and of the league. It would actually not of Riot, of the League of Legends Championship Series LLC, because there's a legal separation there for within Riot's governing structure, and under the National Labor Relations Act, which establishes the exact same principles that Anna was talking about, where it's a fundamental right and you are actually obligated, not only is the right to unionize protected there, so is retaliation against attempts to unionize, conversations about unionization. Exactly. There can't be any blowback by an employer for having those talks. There's all that structural protection is absolutely in place for employees. And without making this kind of too esoteric of a legal conversation, the law treats an employee fundamentally differently than it treats an independent contractor. An employer has more obligations and responsibilities with respect to the employee. The independent contractor is kind of deemed, it's a separation of the law for someone that's kind of on their own but doing things for the employer. I'm trying to simplify this, but not oversimplify it. It's a really nuanced area of employment law and a really important one for these conversations. But on a basic level, if the players are independent contractors, then they do not possess many of the rights granted by the National Labor Relations Act, including the right to unionize and force Riot to basically come to the table. And that's important because you can see in the legal structure of the LCS, Riot attempting intentionally to create that level of separation. And this is absolutely part of the reason for that, right? I mean, there's a reason why. People always ask me, why doesn't Riot just pay the players if there's this history of teams not paying players? And I'm like, well, there are really important legal reasons to create that separation, right? Riot wants only to enter team participation agreements with valid business entities in the U.S. So even if the players aren't going to go work with some existing esports organization, they still have to form, an Inc. or an LLC or something to be able to enter into the team participation agreement, even if they all just own it together. And they pay the money to the organization, and the money goes from the organization to the players. They don't request the contracts that the players sign with their teams. They have summary sheets that, on a high level ask for certain information about the players and their contracts. So they're paying them separately. They're not contracting with them specifically what the players sign. The agreements the players sign, which you wrote an article about, Richard, with David, is in eligibility and release form. It's not we are going to employ you to perform services for our league, right? It's all legally structured in a very clever way and, smart from Riot's perspective, from a managing liability perspective. There's a lot of really good, not nefarious legal reasons why Riot has structured the league in this way. And it complicates the unionization conversation quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, what's interesting for me from a German legal point of view is that obviously it's a complex legal question if LCS players could be qualified as employees. From a German point of view, there's no yes or no. It's really complex. But I think probably, the assessment of this kind of area is really complex. And probably it's governed by Irish law. I came to that conclusion, and not by German law. So you have to take a closer look to the contracts that are there and the law that they're governed by. So it's not very clear how you could qualify those kind of contracts, and obviously it's a huge obstacle when it comes to the discussion around building a union.
And that obstacle, there's so many labor law is a really complex body of law everywhere. I think it'd be really hard to make labor law simple. And so beyond the expense, when we're talking about whether or not now is the right moment to unionize, when I get asked that question, I say, no, I don't think so for all the reasons we've discussed. And then I bring them back to what I think is really worth bringing up, which is there are middle grounds to this. The collective willpower of a unit of people is always going to be more powerful than a single person negotiating for themselves. And that is, I think, where this conversation is worth steering. And if there are, people, if there are pro players listening in or team owners listening in, and that's another part of this complexity, right? What's the bargaining unit going to be? Is it going to be players, teams, Riot? Is it going to be players and teams, Riot? How does this work? Because people ask me this all the time. Well, aren't the teams and players just strongly adverse to each other from a legal perspective? The answer is they can be. The most obvious point of contention for them is salary. Teams want to pay their players as little as possible. Players want to make as much as possible. Pie division. But when you look at something like the grievance process that we've been talking about throughout this show, I think that's something that both players and teams would could, and in my opinion, really should get behind. Because I think the teams benefit from having this type of formalized grievance procedure in place just as much as the players do.
So I've got one last question, and then I've got to wrap up because I'm due on another show.
Of course you are.
This is the life of an esports journalist.
Are we invited, Richard, or what's the deal?
And I'm afraid I can't bring you with me.
Why?
My employers, the Daily Dot, they bind me every Monday at 11 o'clock my time on an evening to talk about esports news for 1 hour. I know. I may want to get your services to stop this slavery. We'll talk about that after the show, I think. But so this is the last question, and I thought this was an interesting one. I'm very good friends with someone who works at ESL called James Lampkin. He's a very influential character and someone that I absolutely believe has one of the better grasps of the esports business as a whole. I often listen to his and defer to his opinions and defer to his wisdom on a variety of topics. And he asked the question, and again, it's for both of you. Where do you see the power dynamic going inside the LCS, especially with regards to, as Bryce said, Riot holding all of the power? Do they think it's healthy for the players or teams to unionize, and how do they think the power dynamic would look in their eyes? And then finally, he added, have you seen anything in an LCS contract that would prevent unionization? So that's the question.
Yeah, well, no, I don't know if anybody could say at this point that, I mean, obviously only Bryce could say, I've seen something like this, but it's confidential. So you can't talk about it. Sorry. But
don't worry,
I tried to trip you up and have you disbarred. That was my plan.
Seriously, what is this kind of question to a lawyer? Come on. But when it comes to leverage, I think it's very important to point out it's always better to speak with one voice united. And this is something actually players as well as teams should really think about, how to actually accomplish that. Because if they don't, there will be always a power asymmetry they cannot overcome. And actually, I would wish for, a more balanced approach towards this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bryce, any thoughts on James's question? I mean, particularly about the power balance.
Yeah. So when I look at the power balance, just from my work right now, and I kind of work at, I have the nice perspective working at the different levels of this, right? I work with some teams, I work with some players, some tournament organizers, etc. And so I kind of, I start to, understand each of their different perspectives on this and what type of leverage they might have vis-a-vis, a major player in the scene like Riot. And just from looking at it, you've got Riot, obviously, by far at the top. You've got teams that have some leverage, and you've got players with very, very little. And the reason for that is because you've got Riot controlling all these decisions. You have very little unity amongst the players. These conversations happen offline. They don't happen publicly. They tend to be small and focused on a particular issue rather than structural. With the exception of Steven, Snoopy's leadership on this, you don't have a major voice of players pushing for this. And teams are a little bit more united. You've kind of got the GG alliance of teams, right? Richard's favorite, the people, the various teams working under GG. You've got what seems to be, Cloud9 and TSM obviously have always had really deep roots, and kind of it seems like Liquid has pulled into that, so it's kind of a three-team alliance there. And so, it's not that hard for the GG folks and the TSM, C9, Liquid folks to come together and have a conversation. If they're on the same page, all of a sudden you're communicating to Riot with the majority of LCS teams. And so they, by virtue of kind of the natural business relationships that have come together, first of all, there's less turnover in that group of people, right? The LCS owners are the LCS owners, and while there definitely is change in that through the relegation and promotion system, you've got some very familiar faces. People have gotten to know each other and work together for a long time. And it's a much smaller group of people. You've only got 10 LCS owners in NA and 10 LCS owners in EU, so it's much easier for, in theory, 20 people, or if we split it, EU and NA, 10 people to come together and get on the same page and then advocate. And they have. And not in any formalized way. I don't think that there's there are conversations that the team owners have together offline as a collective, whereas there's very little, if maybe none of that going on at the player level. So to answer James's question, that's kind of how I view the existing power dynamics. And if we were to if the players were to implement the kind of representative system that I've described, I think that would move the player leverage, much more in line with where the teams are now, because they'd be able to act as a single unit. You still wouldn't be having the same leverage that you have if you unionized, because of the formal economic and legal tools associated with that, but it would be a step in the right direction.
Okay, so look, I think we'll start winding the show down here. We've got about 10 minutes of our allotted time, which you can bill me for at the end.
Oh,
oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
You're talking to lawyers here, right?
I know how it is. It's the same with shrinks as well. It's always on the clock. I know how it is. So look, I think this has been a great show. I'm sure it's going to find a life when the VOD is published and people are watching this. It's a very interesting topic of discussion. I think, again, there's more to come, and I certainly hope both of you remain involved in League of Legends and esports as a whole, because we really need it. We've needed legal representation and interested people with legal expertise to come into this scene and, not just help clean it up like sheriffs in a Wild West movie, but ultimately to offer that level of expertise and insight into what has been, a very difficult area for a lot of young adults to really get to grips with. So I would definitely want to thank both of you for being involved. Just to wrap up the show, I will let you guys plug away, because I'm guessing if somebody wanted to contact you, and you people would be available for consultation. So I'll start with you, Bryce. If somebody was interested in getting in touch with you about an esports matter, how would they best do it?
Yeah, I guess first I just want to say quickly thank you for having us on the show again, Richard. I love having these conversations. They're fascinating from an intellectual standpoint for me, but it's really, greatly appreciated that you use your large microphone to help facilitate the creation of this type of content. I think it's really important. In terms of getting in touch with me, I think my Twitter and my bio are linked on the overlay. I haven't actually seen the overlay, but I trust Sam maybe more than Richard does, and so I'm gonna believe
You'll
that they're
learn
on there. Yeah, exactly. And so you can find my email either through my bio or through my Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter and on Reddit. And yeah, I like I said earlier, I work with pretty much various people at every level of this industry. It's the majority of my working life now is actually doing esports related work, which is a nice feeling. And so, yeah, I'm more than happy to help or just talk about things as they arise, for the various people in the industry.
And Anna, the same question. If I was a German esports enthusiast, or indeed a German esports professional, how would I go about getting in touch with you to secure your services and maybe have you help me?
Yeah, just contact me via Twitter. It's fine. You can see I'm very, very active on Reddit as well. So just write me a message and I'll answer you. It's as simple as that. Thank you, Richard. It was a great pleasure for me being on the show. And as Bryce said, it's quite stimulating to have these kind of discussions. Of course, to me it's obvious, for Bryce and me, some points are more interesting than to others, non-lawyers. But sorry about that. I read on Twitter someone stating like it's detail porn or something like that. So sorry about that, but we're really into it. So thank you for having us and having this platform to actually promote player protection and ways to do this in the future. Thank you.
No problem. Well, look, great to talk to you both. And to everybody who watched, I hope you learned something. I know that we throw these curveballs at you. We do these shows, and 1 minute it's raucous and we're talking about, why players are shit and everything. Oh, you're like, wow, this is great. And then it's like, why are they talking about law? I don't understand this. It's scary. Help me, Richard. Lead me back to the funny side of things. Well, look, it can't always be like that, friends. We've got to take, a healthy amount of intellectual discussion and stimulating discussion along with the banter. That's just simply how it has to be. If you've got any questions that you don't think was addressed in this particular episode, that's fine. You can address them to my fine colleagues here. Certainly address them to me. I'll make sure that they get them, and we'll try and get you an answer if we can. And I really want to thank you all for watching. I'm going to jump over now to the Daily Dots channel where I'll be on the loadout. And we're hoping that we're going to have a fairly normal schedule this week. So Trash Talk, the esports phone-in, where I listen to your wrong opinions. That'll be tomorrow at the regular time of 10 o'clock GMT. Until then, I urge you to come over and support my friends at the Daily Dot. They pay me handsomely, and I don't bring any star power to their show. Nobody watches it. So please come across. Please. But all that remains to be said is thanks to Bryce, thanks to Anna, thanks to Sam, I guess, for kind of producing all of this.
Thank you, Sam.
Hey, look at that. Oh, bless him. Bless him. And, of course, thanks to everybody who watched. And, a shout-out to Snoopy as well for coming in the chat. Big fan of what you do, and all the best with that crazy unionization scheme. So there we go. That was this special edition of First Blood. See you all tomorrow, or in about 5 minutes, if you're going to follow me across. Until then, take care.